I think we're pretty much ready to begin. Yeah.
When will the final be due?
Okay. So let me say a few words about the final, and then we'll turn to the evaluations, and then I'll give you my last lecture for today. Okay. So the final exam, the instructions are going to be extremely clear. All right. But I just want to go over a few rudimentary details having to do with the exam at this juncture. So what you have is you've got 6 questions on the exam, and you have to answer 4 of them. And these 6 questions are divided into 3 groups. So there's group 1, or group A, group B, group C. And you've got 2 questions in the first group. You have to answer both of those questions in the first group. Then you've got 3 and 4 in group B, and you're going to answer one of those 2. And then you've got group C, which has 2 questions, and you answer one of those 2. So you answer 4 out of 6. The length, the font, everything is mentioned very clearly. What kind of citations you're going to give me, again, mentioned very clearly in the instructions. But just to mention it right now, all you need to do is give me the author's name, let's say Said or Gandhi or whoever it is, comma, page 20, page 200, whatever the page number is. That's it. I don't need anything else from you. If you're using an outside source, you have to give me the full citation. You are free to use podcasts, class notes, right? Books, materials. In fact, you'll have to use them, because when you answer a question, always refer to the text, wherever necessary, wherever possible, wherever desirable. You may not cite my lecture notes. So you cannot say something and then in parentheses say, Professor Lal's lecture, comma, November 11th. No, that's not a citation. You can cite my published work just as you would cite the published work of anybody else. One more thing. You get a bonus question. Okay? Let me tell you how the bonus question works. So you still have to do all of this. You don't have any option here. You 2 from group A, 1 from group B, 1 from group C. You have to answer 4 out of 6 questions. If you elect to answer the bonus question, so bonus question is question number 7. However, to make it even more attractive for you, your bonus question need not be this one. It could be a question that you have not answered from either group B or from group C. Okay? So if you answer the bonus question, you'll end up answering 5 out of 7 questions. If your bonus answer is inadequate or completely incorrect, you will not lose any marks. But if it is good, you will get additional marks, and your grade could go up by 1/3 of a letter grade, which means that it could go up from a B to a B plus, okay? Or it could go from a C plus to a B minus, or from a B plus to an A minus. That's what I mean by 1/3 of a letter grade. All right? But you will not lose any marks if you do not answer that bonus question correctly. Okay? However bad it might be, you won't lose any marks. I can give you, you have my assurance on that. So the prudent thing to do is to risk answering that question, but only if you have first answered those 4 questions out of 6. Because if you're running short of time, the imperative thing to do, the prudent thing to do, is to make sure you answer those 4 questions as best as you can. Okay? Is that clear? And you will get the exam not later than 1 p.m. this afternoon by email as a Word attachment. You have 1 week to finish the exam. Okay? Which I think is very generous, frankly. Okay? 1 generous is ample period of time to write a take-home final exam. Any clarifications?
Do you want us to write bonus in the title?
Yeah, you just, you answer that at the end. Do not attempt to answer the bonus question first. Okay? Yeah. A week from today. A week from today. That's December 12th. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Where do we turn it in?
It's mentioned there. You turn it into my office on Thursday between 11 and 12. It's due at 12 noon on Thursday. Okay? Yeah.
We turn it in early.
Yes, of course. no penalties, needless to say. Yeah.
So you say 7 doesn't have to be the bonus question.
It doesn't have to be. So if from group B you had elected to answer question number 3, then your bonus one could be number 4.
Okay, well, that being the case, does that accuracy thing apply to that question too? Say if you answer 3 and 4 and then you intended for
This one, the whichever question you answer from group B as the required question, that you obviously, if your answer is wrong, you get graded down. But the bonus question, you do not get graded down. Whichever one you pick, whether it's 7 or 4 or 3 or 5 or 6. Okay? Yeah.
Just for clarification, it says on the syllabus it's due at 5 p.m. on the 12th?
Yeah. No, it's going to be 12 noon. Yeah.
Okay, 12.
Yeah. It's going to be 12 noon. Whatever I'm telling you today is the correct information. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. Any other questions? Don't ask about citations or anything because it's all mentioned very clearly in the final exam. And they're all obviously essay questions. Okay? And they do cover the entire syllabus, but as you can well imagine, the latter half of the syllabus is given much greater weight because we had a midterm exam. Okay? And you are, again, free to use the podcasts, the readings, outside sources. You do not, let me say this, you do not need outside readings to be able to adequately answer the questions. So I'm just giving you a few tips. Don't waste your time going to Wikipedia, this or that, because these are not the kind of questions that are going to ask you for information. What year did the mutiny take place and where did it break out? No, you don't get essay questions like that. I hope you know that by now. You're going to get questions which are going to make you think about how you're going to formulate an answer. All right? Yes?
Do you have the same reader reading the final test as the midterm?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. But I don't think you need to worry about not being able to understand the comments because you're, if you want to come pick up the exam in the beginning of next quarter, you're free to do so. In my experience in 20 years, that's almost never happened at UCLA, but you're free to do so if you want. Yeah, okay? Just send me an email because I'm not teaching next term, so I'm not coming into my office. All right? But if you want your exam, I'll be coming in 1 day a week probably, and at that point, I can hand over the exam to you. And if anybody is even remotely interested in taking any class with me, again, I'm going to be teaching in the spring, just letting you know. And I'll be teaching a course called The History of India, which is 4,000 years of history in 10 weeks. All right? It's, as I say, from Maya to Mayavati. Maya is a word meaning illusion, and Mayavati is a name of an Indian politician who's 4,000 years in 10 weeks. And I'm going to be doing a seminar, which is a undergraduate seminar, so that's restricted to 15, 20 students, and that's going to be on Indian cinema and nationalism. All right? Okay, before I get into my last lecture, I think what I'd like you to do, because I know that at the end people start to disperse very quickly, and this way we won't get this done. If you can please take 5 to 10 minutes to fill out the evaluations, I would much appreciate it, and do write some comments if you can. You could pass it that way. I'll get you some pencils as well. Yeah. All right. Now, in my previous lecture, I had been talking to you about Gandhi, and I'd been talking about the fact that Gandhi had become a pan-Indian leader, the first really pan-Indian leader. And I'd taken the narrative up to 1930, right? So 1930 is, early in 1930, Gandhi addresses a letter, as you might recall, to the then Viceroy of India, Lord Irwin, where he says that what he proposes to do is to march to the sea, break the salt law. The British had a monopoly, as you might recall, on the production, distribution, and sale of salt. And he's going to break the salt law, and the Viceroy is free to, the British government of India is free to arrest him and prevent him from breaking the law. Right? And as I mentioned to you, when this letter is received at the Viceroy's office, they're absolutely speechless. I mean, they have no idea how to react. to Gandhi. And this, I think, is part of the genius of Gandhi, if I may put it this way. Namely that, you see, one thing that Gandhi had understood was that if you deploy violence against your opponents, they know how to retaliate. Because this is typically how politics has been conducted for thousands of years. Right? Go back to Thucydides. Go back to Thucydides. For those of you who've read the history of the Peloponnesian War, I mean, it's partly a tract on realpolitik, right? The manner in which states and other entities conduct themselves in the international arena. And violence is part of the game. So this is precisely one reason why the British are unable to really respond intelligibly, because they are not accustomed to the idea of nonviolent resistance, particularly when this nonviolent resistance is not coming merely from an individual, as was the case with Henry David Thoreau, who said, hey, my individual conscience does not allow me to pay taxes to the United States government because these taxes are being used to fight a war against Mexico. Right? That was the origin of Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience. But this is not simply a matter of individual conscience. Now what we're saying is that nonviolence has become a part of mass politics. This does not mean that everybody who participated in that movement agreed in principle with the idea of nonviolence, any more than all the people who participated in the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s believed that nonviolence, as practiced, for example, by Martin Luther King and many of the other associates that he had, including Bayard Rustin, for example, any more than all the people who participated in it believed that nonviolence was, you know, the only way to achieve equality. But once a leadership has decided on a course of action of this kind, many people will follow it. And that's exactly what happened in India. Now, one of the other interesting things, before we go on with the political narrative, is that it is the nonviolent movement which made possible to a great extent the entry of women into politics. One of the most striking things about the Indian independence movement is that if you look at the 1920s and you read the autobiographies of upper class, middle class, educated Hindu women, in some cases Muslim women as well, but more Hindu women, women who were not accustomed to leaving their home, because the domestic sphere was the woman's sphere. The idea that a woman would go out into the public domain, would raise a banner, all right, carry posters and march on the streets. I mean, this was almost unknown all over the world. Yes, I mean, there was a suffragette movement in Britain and women took part in that, and there was a movement in the United States as well, but I'm speaking about the totality of women, that the entry of women into politics was not something that had really been witnessed on any grand scale. And certainly in India, if you read the autobiographies of middle-class women, many of them will tell you that it is Gandhi's nonviolent movement that made it possible for them to enter into the public sphere. All right? And I think that the effect of that still lingers on in many ways, which is one reason why there's been, proportionately speaking, a reasonable involvement of women in politics all over South Asia, not just in India. The other thing I want to add, before we, as I said, move on with the political narrative, taking us to 1947, is that if you look at the kind of people that Gandhi drew to him, it is an extraordinary mix of people. And one of the consequences of Gandhian politics was that it shifted the center of gravity from Bengal, which had really been at the helm of Indian politics, right? So Bengal, and on the other hand, Maharashtra. Right? Those are the two hotspots, as it were, but in particular Bengal, because Bengal is where the British had established themselves for over 150 years. Remember that Calcutta served as the capital of British India until the decision, right, to shift the capital, a decision that was announced, as I said, at the Imperial Darbar in 1911, and then it's only in the early 1920s that a new capital is going to be built in New Delhi. But Calcutta had been the capital. This is where the British presence had been most well established. This is where the Bengal Renaissance took place, so forth and so on. One of the effects of the entry of Gandhi into politics was it shifted the center of politics. In fact, I would say there were several new centers, including the Indian heartland, Bihar, UP. Many of the followers of Gandhi came from the Indian heartland. And then, of course, you had Gujarat. Of course, Gandhi is a Gujarati, so he's coming from Western India. It is also the case that it was no longer the elites who were involved. So now I'm not speaking about, of course, in mass politics means mass politics, but I'm speaking about even the people who were, in fact, actually quite close to Gandhi. Many of these people came from relatively smaller towns. Okay? They did not come from, highly anglicized kind of backgrounds. So there were exceptions, of course. Well, the most notable exception would be Jawaharlal Nehru, whose name I've written on the top, who is going to be the person who is going to become the Prime Minister of India in August 1947 when India achieves independence. He's going to be the Prime Minister, in fact, until his death in 1964. Right? So he is a person who's going to lead the Congress Party in the aftermath of independence, because Gandhi is going to be assassinated on 30th January 1948, just 6 months after independence. Right? And there are interesting questions. I mean, I want to spend a couple of minutes on Nehru, because one of the questions that comes up is, well, what kind of legacy did Gandhi leave behind? Did he leave behind any legacy at all? Right? I mean, if you look, for example, at, I think, let's say the 20th century, I would say that in our times, the three people who are most well known for having, in some measure or the other, adopted some of Gandhi's strategies and some of his thinking and his whole emphasis on nonviolence. Three living people today. None of them is an Indian. I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela, I'm thinking of the Dalai Lama, and Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of Burma. Right? Well, she's not the political leader as such, but she's a leader of the masses of Burma. Right? These are the three people who have, right, to the greatest extent, I think, carried out the legacy of Gandhi. Now, Nehru, however, is a critical figure. And we'd have to try to understand in what way the Gandhian legacy is going to continue with somebody like Nehru, because the one way to understand him is to see what happens in the 1950s, where, in a nutshell, the world is divided between two camps. And those camps are obviously the US and its allies, which is the NATO countries, and then you have the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union and its allies. Right? And that's, of course, what is called the Cold War. And one of the things that Nehru did was he tried to create a third path, and that was a path of non-alignment. In fact, you could say that Nehru is one of the chief architects of the idea of non-alignment, that we're going to be neither with this camp nor with this camp. And in 1956, there's going to be a conference in Bandung. Bandung is in Indonesia, where the countries from the global south are going to meet in order to be able to implement a concerted plan for non-alignment, okay, to create a third distinct path in world politics. And I'm suggesting to you this was, in fact, actually partly the legacy of Mohandas Gandhi. What are the other kind of people who were attracted to him? I could give you a list that's got 500 people on it, okay? All of them eminent in their own, right, okay, in their own particular way. But just looking at two or three major figures, so we've got Sardar Patel, who's a Gujarati lawyer, so he comes from a part of Gujarat not very far from Gandhi, but he's nowhere near as anglicized as Jawaharlal Nehru is. And Jawaharlal Nehru, by the way, is a great writer. I mean, one of the books that I teach often by him is a book called The Discovery of India, all right, which is a history of India that he wrote without any notes whatsoever while he was serving a prison term. All right, a remarkable work of literature, in fact, not just a remarkable work of history, a remarkable work of literature. So he's a stylist of the English prose. Now, Patel comes from a much more provincial kind of background. He is nicknamed the Iron Man of India, because he had a kind of a hard-nosed approach to politics, a realpolitik approach. And when, in 1947, India achieves independence. So I'm now getting into the political narrative at the same time as well. When India achieves independence in 1947, right, there's a particular problem that has to be addressed. And that problem is that, recall, once again, that you had not just British India, you had over 500 native states. I've mentioned them quite often, these princely states. So these princely states were each given an option, right? Because when independence is achieved, it comes at the price of partition. That is, there's going to be two nation states that are going to be created now. One is, of course, India, and one is Pakistan, which is a Muslim majority state. Okay, a Muslim majority state. And when I say Muslim majority state, let me just here, right, so here's a map of India, okay, and then you've got these princely states, you know, large number of them. Here's Hyderabad here, Kashmir over here, so on and so forth. Right? And the rest of it, and then there are princely states elsewhere too. I'm not giving you a full map. Then, you know, the rest of the territory is what is called British India. Now, when partition is achieved, independence is achieved in 1947, they're going to create a state here called Pakistan. And what is Pakistan? It's a Muslim majority state. We'll go back to the narrative and you'll see how Pakistan came around. But I'm on the subject of Patel, which is an associate of Gandhi, because it's also important to understand that even though I myself have highlighted the importance of Gandhi, that the Congress party is a much larger organization. It's bigger than Gandhi. And there are a great many other political players of consequence, okay, in these 2 decades that we're really speaking about. Now, so Pakistan is created. However, there happen to be a huge number of Muslims over here as well, in this part of the country. And when Pakistan is created, that's exactly what's going to happen. One part of Pakistan is going to be on the western frontier. Then you've got 1,500 miles of Indian territory, and then you've got the second half of Pakistan over here. Okay, and you know, they very often they say they used to say that one of the problems that Pakistani children always had when they were going to school, and it's a problem that persists down to the present day, at least till 1971, and that was you could not draw a map of Pakistan without first drawing a map of India. Okay, you couldn't, right? Because you otherwise all you would have is you would have a little, you know, okay, chunk here and then a chunk here. Well, what kind of map is that? You know, right? You couldn't draw. So the whole idea that you would achieve autonomy and independence is compromised in the cartographic sense immediately. Okay, because what do children do in school? You learn to play with maps. You're always given maps in history, geography, right? So interesting. Now, where does Patel come in? Patel comes in because these princely states were all given an option. Option number 1, join India. Okay, forfeit your independence, get absorbed into India. Because naturally, all 550 states could not become independent nation states. That's not possible, obviously. Right? So option 1, absorb yourself into India, which meant that the ruler of that state would sign a treaty saying, I relinquish my rights, this state no longer exists, it becomes a part of India. Option number 2, join a treaty and become a part of Pakistan. Okay? Option number 3, which is not really an option, stay independent. Try doing that. Right? Of course, none of them succeeded at all. The dispute over Kashmir, which you still have today, goes back to 1947. Now, where Patel comes in was that one of the states, for example, was right here, Hyderabad, a Muslim majority state. But it's not going to become an independent state. Now, India is not going to permit that. And of course, if you have a Muslim majority state which is completely landlocked inside India, how is it even going to survive? I mean, imagine if India just imposed a blockade, right? So the ruler of Hyderabad was reluctant. I mean, I'm giving you a very simplified version because we'd really have to spend a lot of time. Was reluctant. You have factions on both sides, those who want the state integrated into India, those who do not. So what the Indian government had to do, now this is the government of independent India. Remember, this is post August 15th, 1947. They had to undertake what was called police action. They basically had to forcibly integrate Hyderabad into India. The person who is responsible for the integration of the Indian states into the Indian Union is Sardar Patel. Okay? That's one of the reasons he's called the Iron Man. You know, he wouldn't brook any nonsense. All right? that I know how to deal with these states, he said. And in fact, largely it was through diplomacy. 95% of it was through diplomacy, but there were times when he had to undertake police action. So this is one of the people who becomes a chief associate of Gandhi, because you needed a man who could discipline the troops. And when I say troops here, I'm speaking about the non-violent resistors who become part of these great campaigns. I mean, it's unprecedented in history, frankly, you know, because you're really speaking about troops without weapons, without arms, but highly disciplined, extremely disciplined. Okay? So that's Sardar Patel, and then Maulana Azad, just giving you a third instance. Maulana Azad is an Indian Muslim. However, at the time of 1947, he decides he will not go over to Pakistan. Many of the Indian elites, Muslim elites, decided that they would migrate and they would become part of the new nation state called Pakistan, which was a Muslim majority state. But Maulana Azad was one of these people who did not believe in this two-nation theory, did not believe that India was just for Hindus and that Pakistan was just for Muslims. Right? So Maulana Azad is an Indian Muslim nationalist, which is the best way to describe him, but he's also a great scholar, by the way, of the Quran, among many other things, writes prolifically, just gives you an idea of the kind of people who are associated with Mohandas Gandhi. Right? So we're saying Gandhi was able to attract an unusual cast of characters, an extremely unusual cast of characters, very, very talented as well. He's able to initiate a new kind of mass politics. Women come into politics. It's no longer a matter of elites in the presidency towns, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras. Many of the people who are active are coming from the smaller towns. And to give you again a measure of how unusual Gandhi is, let me give you a very simple illustration of that. One of the things that happened in India after the rebellion of 1857-58 was crushed by the British was the British passed an Arms Act. The Arms Act forbid Indians from owning arms. Right? So this is the exact opposite of your Second Amendment to the Bill of Rights in the United States, which of course is a Bible for a good many people in the US, as you know. Right? It's the exact opposite. You cannot own arms as a private citizen. Now, this is where the irony is. It's not an irony once one reflects on why Gandhi adopted that position. Gandhi was opposed to the Arms Act. Now, here is the person who is the chief architect of Indian independence, advocating mass nonviolent resistance. The idea of ahimsa, ahimsa is the Sanskrit word for nonviolence, and I should say, by the way, that we translate it into English as nonviolence, but the translation is inadequate, because in English, the prefix, is really a negative. It's a pejorative, you know. So violence is the norm, non-violence is the departure from the norm. In Sanskrit, the which is the equivalent of the non, does not carry the same weight. In other words, ahimsa and himsa really operate, himsa would be violence, ahimsa would be non-violence, operate at the same plane. Okay? Now, what is interesting is that, as I said, Gandhi opposed the Arms Act. How is it possible for him to oppose the Arms Act? If he believes in non-violence, why is he opposing an act which says that people may not own weapons? And the reason for that is that Gandhi made a distinction between the non-violence of the brave or the non-violence of the strong, and, on the other hand, the non-violence of the weak. His fundamental argument is that there is no bravery involved at all, no courage involved at all in not having arms. The bravery resides in having access to arms and deciding that you don't want to use them. Okay? That in fact the Arms Act had emasculated India. It had emasculated India. It had turned Indian men into wimps, if I may use a colloquialism. Right? This is one reason why he's opposed to the Arms Act. Because his argument would have been, let there be the possibility of being able to use violence, but let us learn that we should not use it, because it is not effective, it is not morally correct to use violence. When you perpetrate violence against another person, you in fact are indicating to the person that you are always in the right. That's one of the many arguments that Gandhi is going to give against violence. So there are epistemological, ontological, moral, political reasons why one should not use violence. Right? So this is one of the ways in which you measure Gandhi. That person who is a person of extraordinary integrity. Of course, he's savvy as well, because he's involved in politics. And in fact, one of the things that you learn from the life of Gandhi is that it's no longer possible to be a saint unless you're involved in politics. That is that you must go, the Indian idea of being a saint was you go to the Himalayas. You go up to 20,000 feet, give up, your family, your possessions, your children, your house, all of that, right, and start meditating. And Gandhi is saying the only way to be saintly in the 21st century and thereafter is you wade into the slum of everyday life. You wade into the slum of politics. Politics is a slum, but you have to wade into it, and that's where your saintliness is going to get tested. It's not going to get tested at 20,000 feet. It's not going to get tested by becoming a new age hippie, in California style. Okay? This is, if I may put it, what Gandhi's politics is about. And he would often say that those who say that politics has nothing to do with religion know the meaning neither of politics nor of religion. Now, before we go to the political narrative, very quickly, Hind Swaraj. Okay, I've written that somewhere over here, there, all right, on the board. Hind Swaraj, which is part of the reading that you have, it's this little treatise written by Gandhi in 1909 in 10 days, all right. The English translation, it's also called Indian Home Rule. The word Swaraj, which we have encountered a number of times, okay, so Raj is rule, Swa is self. But self-rule here means two things. Number one, it means political emancipation from British rule, so self-rule, okay. But Gandhi argues, and this is again what distinguishes him from all the other Indian nationalists, very clearly, is that you do not have the right to really ask for political rights for yourself. You cannot really claim to lead the people if you do not have control over yourself. Because all of us, as human beings, are susceptible to desires, to ambition, right? And more often than not, this leads us astray. This leads us to renounce the ethical path. In the interest of improving our position, we'll take shortcuts, we'll do something wrong. Of course, in politics, it happens all the time. Right? Gandhi is saying, before we, as Indians, can claim to rule ourselves, because what is a claim? That India should be free from British rule. But if India will be freed from British rule only so that Indians can now behave exactly like the Englishmen were behaving, then Gandhi does not want that kind of Swaraj. Right? He does not want that kind of Swaraj. We have to first learn to control ourselves, control our anger, control our palate, control our desires. Right? Because in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi makes the argument, right? He makes the argument that it wasn't simply the cunningness of the British which made it possible for them to rule India. It wasn't simply the fact that they were more ambitious than Indians were. Right? Because there is this interesting question. What made it possible for the British to rule India for 200 years? I mean, they were always a very small minority in the country. A very small minority. What made it possible for Britain to be in India for so long? And India is not a small place. It was the principal colony that any European power had, not just the British. Right? So one of the arguments that Gandhi will advance in Hind Swaraj is the argument that we allowed the British to take control, okay, over India. Why? Because we were seduced by the British. We were seduced by the glitter of Western material civilization. Right? This is one of the reasons why, in fact, we fell prey to the British. And so if you read Hind Swaraj, it will seem to be a very simple work. It will seem to be a diatribe. For those of you who have actually bothered to read it, you'll notice that he's got chapters where he critiques the railways. And I made an ironical observation about that in my previous lecture. Nobody used the railways as much as Gandhi did. Okay? He critiques the doctors. He critiques lawyers. And one of the reasons he critiques many of these institutions or professions is because essentially what does a lawyer do? A lawyer comes between you and the party with whom you are having a dispute. Think of the British. What was one of the main justifications that the British offered for their own rule? We are here to keep the peace between Indians. We're here to keep law and order, because if we are not here, these Indians will go at each other's throats. They're going to massacre each other. Right? We bring a sense of law and order. We bring a notion of fair play, notion of justice. That's going to be one of the principal justifications. There are many others as well. The British is a third party. We transcend all the differences. In fact, one of their critiques of Gandhi was Gandhi claims to speak for the masses, but no Indian can ever speak for another Indian. Why? Because according to the communal ideology, an Indian is first a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh, and a Hindu will speak for a Hindu, a Muslim will speak for a Muslim. An Indian will never speak for another Indian. The British claim is we speak for everybody. Right? So the British are the third party. Now the lawyers, what are the lawyers? They're third parties. I have a conflict with somebody. The lawyer essentially, from Gandhi's standpoint, Gandhi himself, by the way, is a lawyer. Don't forget that. So he's not speaking as somebody who's completely uninformed about the profession. Right? He'd had plenty of experience, 2 decades of experience. And Gandhi's view was that in fact lawyers are more likely than not going to muddle the issue. They are really out for their own interest, not for the interests of the parties involved in the dispute. Similarly, a doctor, you might say, how is a doctor a third party? The doctor comes between you and your body. You and your body. Because most illnesses, in fact, there's a very interesting book written in 1966, which I would argue completely confirms Gandhi's standpoint, written by one of the greatest social critics of the 20th century, Ivan Illich. The book is called Medical Nemesis. For those of you who are planning to go to medical school, read that book before you even think about going to medical school. Because one of the arguments that Illich makes is that 90% of the problems are iatrogenic. Iatrogenic means they are actually produced by the very people who are supposed to resolve the problem. That is, by the medical profession. Now, you don't have to believe that, of course. It's an argument. And what Gandhi is saying is that the doctor comes between you and your body. You don't understand your own body. You have a problem, you simply go to the doctor, he prescribes a certain number of pills, right? But you have to understand why your body has reacted in that way. And the whole endeavor has to be to understand the body. So one of the ways in which we can understand Gandhi and just how radical is, he tries to bring the body into the body politic. Body politic means the wider public sphere. And this is one of the reasons why one of the major weapons in the arsenal of Satyagraha, Satyagraha, remember, is a name that he coins, right? Satyagraha is a force of resistance, the force of truth, that you offer your opponent Satyagraha. One of the major weapons in the arsenal of Satyagraha is fasting. You go on a fast, or what in the West is called the hunger strike. Right? And what are you doing? You're bringing your body, right, onto the public sphere. All right, now, I think I've said just enough to give you some idea of what Hind Swaraj is about, how radical the critique is. 1930, let's go back. 1930, the Salt March. Just a year or two before that, the Indian Congress Party had passed a resolution. That resolution was a resolution for what was called Purna Swaraj. You don't need to worry about the phrase. The meaning is full, complete independence. So this is after the Simon Commission of 1928. The Indian National Congress responds by saying, no half-hearted measures by the British or concessions by the British will now be adequate. We want complete independence. And one reason why Gandhi had to undertake political action was that once the Congress had passed that resolution, then of course they had to put teeth into that resolution. You can sign any number of petitions, or sign any number of resolutions, but how do you put teeth into the resolution? You have to do something, don't you? And Gandhi is then going to undertake the Salt Satyagraha. One of the consequences of the salt satyagraha is that after that it is very much clear, except of course to those who do not want to see, and that's a good many Britishers, but it's very clear that the writing is on the wall. What is the writing on the wall? That the British will really no longer be able to hold India forever. That independence is now really on the horizon. And one of the best illustrations of that recognition is the fact that in the aftermath of the salt satyagraha, when, as I said, the jails were filled, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be arrested. The country is in chaos, essentially. The British can't really govern. So what do they have to do? They have to invite Mahatma Gandhi to negotiate. This is the first time that the British actually ever negotiated with an Indian leader for independence. That's what you need to note. Because many critics argue, well, what was really achieved at the end of the negotiations? Nothing. The fact that the British negotiated at all was an admission that the writing is on the wall. And no one understood that better than one of Gandhi's greatest political antagonists. Also the great hero of the Western world, but in India they have a very different view of this man, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a member of the British cabinet. He was not the prime minister. You know that Churchill's going to be the prime minister of Britain during World War II. And that's one of the reasons why, of course, Churchill is lionized, because he's, brought Britain out of its problems. But in 1930, Churchill was a member of the British cabinet, and Churchill said, I have to tell you what the occasion for this remark is, that when I said Gandhi was invited to negotiate, Gandhi goes to London. This is going to be his last trip out of India. Okay? He's never going to leave India again after this. He goes to India, and they have what is called the Round Table Conference. They were going to have another Round Table Conference the following year as well. He goes to England, yeah. He goes to England, to London, for the Round Table Conference, right, as the person representing the Indian National Congress in 1930. And Churchill, and then, by the way, when Gandhi is in London, he's invited to have tea with the King Emperor at Buckingham Palace. Now, that's a story in itself, all right, an extraordinary story in itself. What happened there? Here's this man wearing a loincloth, for those of you who have seen photographs of Gandhi, and so in fact actually a journalist, because for those of you who know what Gandhi's dress was, he wore a loincloth and he would have this shawl over his shoulder. I mean, most of the time in India he went around bare-chested. Okay, so this reporter tapped Mr. Gandhi on the shoulder as he was walking up the steps of Buckingham Palace and said, Mr. Gandhi, do you propose seeing the King Emperor dressed in this fashion? Right? And he's got sandals which he's made himself. Right? And Gandhi says, I think the King Emperor is wearing enough for both of us. Right? Yeah, his humor was also extraordinarily interesting. So Churchill says, the sight of a half-naked fakir. A fakir is a type of a holy man found in the East. Okay? The sight of a half-naked fakir walking up the steps of Buckingham Palace to parley. Parley means to speak, to converse. To parley on equal terms with the representative of the King Emperor is nauseating and disgusting. This was Churchill's response. And he also says, I did not become, the King Emperor's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Right? That I'm not going to permit this idea of Indian independence to take roots. Churchill was very clear. But none of that really matters. What matters is that the British negotiated, and after that, essentially, it was very clear that independence would come. Now, if we move into the 1930s, the principle, I can't take any questions right now. Yeah, but I have to get to my end of my narrative. 1930s, okay, 1930s, as we move into the 1930s, the fundamental problem that is going to begin to emerge, it's not that acute in the 1930s though. It's going to become much more acute after 1939, moving into the early 1940s. And that is a problem of communalism. Right? And you have to go back again to our previous discussion on communalism, this idea that the Hindus and Muslims are two monolithic, distinct communities. This idea is going to begin to take root. And remember, the Muslim League is founded in 1907, right, with the active encouragement of the British. And of course, the British are now, there's no question about it, they are interested in this idea of Muslim separatism, because it's one way in which they can defang nationalism, Indian nationalism. If you could show that there are a good number of Indians who are not interested in independence because they fear what might happen to them in a country where the majority belong to the Hindu faith, right? That a good many Muslims might say, well, we are not interested in this idea of independence, because what will be our position in the Hindu majority India? But this whole idea, you see, of Hindus, Muslims, Hindu majorities, I'm saying this was a consequence of a certain style of thinking that starts to become quite important. And of course, in the 1930s, this is the role of ideology. In the 1930s, there are going to be some takers for it, although it's very interesting that when they held provincial elections. So remember that one of the things that the Act of 1917 had done was what? Reserved subjects, transferred subjects, right? And throughout the 1920s and 30s, more and more concessions are going to be made. So by the 1930s, what you really have is you have provincial governments, which are largely being run by Indians now. And what is extraordinarily interesting is that even in the late 1930s, when they had provincial elections in India, even in the Muslim majority areas, right? So now I think you know what I mean when I say Muslim majority area, where, as in the western part of the country, in the Punjab, or in portions of Bengal, right? That here, Muslims were in a majority. That's what it means to speak of a Muslim majority province, or Muslim majority area. There were large chunks of Bengal where the Muslims were not, but there were eastern Bengal, Muslims were in a majority. Even in the late 1930s, in the provincial elections that took place, even in the Muslim majority provinces, the Muslim League, which claimed to represent the Muslims, could not achieve a majority. The Indian National Congress was still by far the dominant political party. The question for us is, how come in the space of just a few years things would change? Now, 1939, World War II comes about. Same set of conditions in a way, that is with respect to the fact that India is now at war, in principle, with the Nazis, right? Because India is a British colony. But this is where the Indian National Congress took the decision that it would be neutral. Of course, in this respect, conditions have now completely altered, because 1914, when World War I broke out, the Indian National Congress was not the kind of organization it was in 1939. A lot of water has flowed under the bridge in 25 years. I mean, you've got a nationalist movement that has mushroomed in all kinds of directions. Gandhi is a world historical figure already, by far, right? And the Indian National Congress is a very large political party, right? The masses have entered into politics. So 1939, the British government really wanted the Congress to state that they were against fascism and Nazism. And of course, the Indian National Congress took the view that, well, we are against that, but we are also against imperialism. What are you going to do about that? They tell the British, right? Because why should any Indian think that the Nazis are better than the imperialists, right? And it's a logical argument. Of course, some people don't think it is, because some people think that, well, you can distinguish between dictators. Some are better and some are not so good, right? Or despots or dictatorial states, because certainly in India, that's what the British were. So the Congress adopts a position of neutrality. In 1942, Gandhi is going to lead the last large-scale movement. It's called the Quit India Movement. And in the Quit India Movement, again, simplifying it enormously, it's quite controversial, because a fair bit of violence breaks out. For example, railway lines are going to be sabotaged by various Indians. And of course, Gandhi didn't approve of it. He didn't, because these are acts of violence. But the British held him responsible. And I think it's certainly true that by 1942, there is an element of frustration in Gandhi, you know. Element of frustration. He's now been at the helm of Indian politics for well over 2 decades, right? Independence still hasn't yet arrived. And there is an element of frustration. But it's also very clear that Gandhi obviously did not advocate these acts of sabotage or other forms of violence. The British response to the Quit India movement was to lock up the entire Congress leadership in jail for 2 years. Gandhi immediately put into jail, his wife put into jail, Secretary Jawaharlal Nehru, Patel, Maulana Azad, tens of thousands, local level Congress leaders all imprisoned. The Muslim League, however, took the view that it would support the British war effort. And that is important. Because what happened essentially was that, in that political environment, when the Muslim League told the British government, we will support the war effort, they were going to be rewarded. It's a kind of a political vacuum in the sense that the Indian Congress Party, National Congress, which is the largest political organization, has essentially abandoned that space. They're all locked up. They can't really do anything, right? Except for these acts of sabotage taking place here and there. The Muslim League is going to become extraordinarily important in those 2, 3, 4 years. And this is when Muslim separatism, the idea of Muslim separatism, begins to take root seriously. So Muslim separatism here being the idea that the Muslims of India, what was their percentage of the population of undivided India? Roughly a quarter, 22, 23%. Okay? So you're substantial. You're not talking about a minuscule minority, substantial chunk of the population. So the Muslim separatism here is the idea that the interests of the Muslims are going to be best served in a political system which is a political system run by Muslims for Muslims, effectively. You know, whether it was a theocratic state, in the sense in which you could speak of Israel as a theocratic state when Israel is founded, a Jewish, explicitly Jewish state, right? Because the founder of Pakistan, the man who is going to push this idea furthest and who's going to become the chief antagonist of Gandhi in that sense, because Gandhi did not favor the idea of partition. Because what does partition mean? If you're going to have a Muslim majority state, you're going to have to do what? You're going to have to carve it out of India, won't you? Right? And that's where we go back to the problem I had articulated half an hour ago. The problem here, and I simplified the problem for you immensely, because the problem is not simply the fact that, oh, you've got a huge chunk of Muslims here, and you've got a huge chunk of Muslims here, and then there's this huge, okay, land mass called India in between. So how are we going to have these two little elements being one state? The problem is that there are Muslims all over the country. There are villages where you've got 20% Muslims, 80% Hindus, or 80% Muslims, 20% Hindus, and they're here, they're here, they're here, they're all over the country. You've got Muslim majority areas inside India. Hyderabad, I gave you the instance of that. Lucknow, remember Awadh, right? The annexation of Awadh, 1856, Muslim majority province or area. So what are the Muslims here going to do? What are they going to do? Because they're not all going to become independent states, obviously. In fact, Jinnah had this idea. It's really quite an extraordinary idea, you know. And that idea was that they would create a safe corridor which would run like this, okay, for the Muslims. So all the Muslims, for example, from here would all be pushed into this corridor, because everybody couldn't go to Pakistan and everybody couldn't go to the eastern part of Pakistan. That became East Pakistan. Now it's Bangladesh, because East Pakistan found it was a problem coexisting with West Pakistan. That's one, because they're all Muslims here, which shows very clearly that religion need not be the determinant factor. Because why did the Muslims of East Pakistan eventually decide that they wanted to break away from the Muslims of West Pakistan and become an independent state, which is called Bangladesh in 1971? It shows very clearly, I can't give you a full-fledged explanation here right now, right? That this idea of the two-nation theory, one nation for the Muslims, one for the Hindus, was always a bizarre idea in many respects, right? And really had no basis in the Indian past. Because if you were a Bengali Muslim, as opposed to a Punjabi Muslim, simplifying it a bit, you found yourself having a lot more affinity with other Bengalis, even if they were not Muslims. Even if they were not Muslims. All right? So this idea was, one idea was that you would drive all the Muslims into this corridor. I mean, imagine, right? And this would be, quote, a safe corridor extending for, 1,500 miles or whatever the distance is. Right? Of course, that idea was never implemented. But one of the consequences of partition was going to be that there was going to be a mass migration of people. It is still today the largest migration of people over a short period of time in history. It is estimated that approximately 15 million people, okay, cross borders. I'll get to that in just a second. Let me just go back just a tad. So we're in the 1940s. We're saying that Muslim separatism become important. The Congress leaders are in jail. 1944, the Congress leaders are going to be released, because by then it's pretty clear that the end of World War II is there. Not at the Pacific side of it. With Japan, it's still going on. But certainly in the European front, things were beginning to look much clearer, right? Eventually leading, obviously, to the decimation of the Nazi regime, the suicide of Hitler, and so forth and so on. So 1945, the British, at the end of the war, the British are very clear in their mind now that they cannot hold on to India. Okay? Some people argue that they left India. Well, yes, they did leave India. Whether they were booted out is another way of putting it, right? Because obviously, to leave, did they leave on their own terms? Were they, what is the nature of this departure? And that's an interesting question, because in some respects, the legacy of British rule continues on. I mentioned to you, for example, that if you look at the higher level courts in India, right? English is the only language used in higher level courts. If you belong to an Indian middle class family, you always want your child to go to an English medium school, right? Some of the most gifted writers in the world today, writing in English, are from India and Pakistan. A good many of them, in fact, I would argue, right? And one could continue on and on in this vein. The Constitution of India, right? Of course, not really, because Britain, as some of you know, doesn't really have a written constitution. So when they drafted the Constitution, they looked to the American Constitution and a number of other constitutions in the world to see how they would draft a Constitution of India. The point is, 1945, the British recognize that this is it. 1946, they're going to appoint a new viceroy. His name is Mountbatten, related to, by the way, to Queen Victoria, Earl Mountbatten of Burma. And Mountbatten comes as the last viceroy, and when he comes to India, he makes a pronouncement that the British will leave India, right? And I cannot now enter into the negotiations, because at this time, the partition is not an accomplished fact. In fact, it's not at all clear that there's going to be a partition. But that is what would end up happening, right? That they could not come to terms, the Indian parties and the British, and finally, in August 1947, India is going to become independent. Pakistan is going to be created as a separate nation state. I mentioned to you Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Let me mention a couple of other people here, just so that you understand what are some of the other kinds of problems that were creeping in. Okay? So one of Gandhi's antagonists was Subhash Chandra Bose, who creates what's called the Indian National Army. Bose is an Indian nationalist. He's a contemporary of Gandhi, younger than Gandhi, 25 years younger than Gandhi, lionized in Bengal, even today, by the way, the great hero in Bengal. Okay? And Bose's view was essentially, if I may put it to you, I'm putting it in a capsule form, was the view that is associated with Malcolm X in America. Remember the slogan, by any means necessary. If you want to achieve your objective, if you have to use violence, use it. And what Bose is going to do, Bose is a socialist. He's a very interesting character, but I have to give you the gist of the matter as far as we're concerned, that in the period of World War II, Bose is going to go over to the Nazis. He's actually going to go to Berlin. He's going to go to Berlin, he's going to meet with Hitler, he's going to stay in Germany, and the Nazis are going to allow him to broadcast, because his main objective is to get rid of the British from India. And since Germany is an enemy of Britain, it's perfectly fine from his point of view, right, to ally himself with the Nazis. Right? Yeah, there might have been moral qualms on his part, I don't know, but we have to go by the fact that, in fact, he did actually go over to the Nazis. But he creates his army, and that's the fascinating part of it. It's called the Indian National Army. And the Indian National Army actually sees quite a bit of action, military action during World War II. For example, in places like Singapore, the eastern frontier of India, northeast India. What is the Indian National Army? It's composed of Indian soldiers from the British Army of India who have defected or who have been captured, and recruits from places such as Singapore, the Malay world, where there was a huge Indian population, again, much of that indentured laborers. Right? So he puts together patches together this army. It's called the Indian National Army. And in 1946, so the British are still holding on to the rituals of sovereignty. Even though independence is on the horizon, it's only 1 year away now. But in 1946, at this point, the British are still ruling India. They are going to put the 3 members of the Indian National Army on trial on charges of treason. They pick 1 Hindu, 1 Sikh, 1 Muslim. Okay? So it's a fascinating political trial. And then finally, the other person you need to know about before we come to the last couple of minutes is B.R. Ambedkar, who is the leader of the Dalits. So he and Gandhi have a considerable number of differences, but for our narrative, the importance of Ambedkar is that even though he's a Dalit, even though he belongs to the lowest sector of Indian society, he is going to be chosen to draft the Indian Constitution. He's going to be chosen to draft the Indian Constitution, the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. Okay? And there's a committee that's going to be charged with creating this constitution. And a group of people, this group is called the Constituent Assembly. It's an extraordinary group of people who gather together. This is before India has formally become independent. This is in late 1946. But of course, the British have announced that they're going to leave India. Okay? So 1946, late 1946, a Constituent Assembly is going to be put together, and they're going to start to draft a constitution, which will take 3 years. Ambedkar is the chief drafter. He's assisted, of course, by a large number of people, and the constitution will come into effect on 26 January 1950. Independence comes 1947, August 1947. I mentioned to you already, of course, the circumstances under which partition takes place. I mentioned to you the fact that there is a mass migration. What do I mean by the mass migration? Very simply, Muslims, because, you have to think about it. How did they draw the line between India and Pakistan? How did they actually draw the line? Right? And one of the most astonishing parts of that story is they bring from Scotland a man who had never been to India. Never been to India. In fact, he positively loathed and despised India. I can tell you that, if you read his private diary. They bring him from Scotland and say, and they appoint what's called a boundary commission, and he's the chair of the boundary commission. Draw up a line on the west and on the east to separate India from Pakistan. Long story. But what is the migration? When they draw up the line, there are Muslims who are left behind in India. What are they going to do? The Muslims are going to go this way into Pakistan. There are Hindus now who are just on this side of the border. They are going to go to India. Right? And the same thing is going to happen on the eastern frontier. That's a migration. 15 million people, 1 million people killed in the riots. Because people lose their property, for example. You're a big landlord, and suddenly you just have to cross over to the other side now. you abandon all your property. Too complicated a story. Again, a whole seminar that I do just on the partition of India. Okay, right? So we are encapsulating it in 5 minutes. And lastly, then, the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi in January 1948, 6 months after independence, by a Hindu extremist who thought that Gandhi was in part responsible for the partition. You know, that Gandhi had always appeased the Muslims, you know, with his talk about Hindu-Muslim harmony, so forth and so on. So, you know, there are interesting questions to be asked. I've anticipated some of that already by suggesting that, look, one of the things to ask about is, well, what was the legacy of the British in India? Now, we're not here to, you know, do the pros and cons of that. And that's not an interesting way to do it anyhow. And I think I told you at the outset of this course that I think that one has to be always resolutely opposed to all forms of colonialism and imperialism and oppression. So I think in the long run, you know, we can't really say that, well, this is what was good and this is what was bad. That's not what we're interested in doing. What we are interested in is trying to understand the contours of this history over the last 200 years, partly in an endeavor to understand what is the nature of oppression, what is the nature of interaction between people belonging to different cultural, political dispensations, right? And what are some of the problems in the writing of that kind of history. Thank you.